Let's see, is everybody here? Jeff, Steve, Marv, Dan, John. Yeah, hey, we can get rolling. It's 6 o'clock on the dot, looks like to me. Linda, you ready? You're muted, I can't hear you.
Ready. We're live.
All right, call the meeting to order. Chief, it's all yours, unless you want to say something first, Cynthia. All right.
Cynthia, do you have anything?
No, I was just going to indicate that, you know, for the last several months, we've talked about having the police, the chief introduce some information and provide background on our department and its operations. He spent the better part of the last several weeks putting together some information for you all. The information included in the packet is quite voluminous. He's going to give a brief presentation, and then really what we'd like to be able to do is have discussion with you all and be able to answer questions that you might have with regard to our police department, composition, operations, etc. So with that, I will turn it over to the chief.
Thank you. Y'all got a copy of the report in your packet. Started out, thought we'd be around 3, 4, maybe 5 pages, and it wasn't. So I'm gonna do my best to not sound like an engineer talking about wastewater and stuff like that. And we're gonna try to touch on the high points and then try to answer questions. So let's see.
Good thing Chuck's not here. He'd be crying right now.
Yeah, I'm gonna do my best not to pull a Chuck. So
That will be shared with him tomorrow, you know.
He'll comment here in a minute if we're on Facebook. This is our org chart for our police department. This has been relatively the same makeup, absent a few positions added here or there for about the last 14, 15 years. The same structure has been in place like this. And then as we grow and as the city grows, positions have been added here and there. And the most recent 2 have been the second SRO position. And it says police clerk on there, but she's really the prosecutor assistant and administrative assistant to the department. And that wouldn't all fit in one box. So that's been the 2 most recent additions to that chart and our makeup. We have 21 positions in the department. One of them is that civilian position, prosecutor's assistant. There's 1 police chief position, 1 captain's position. We have 4 sergeants, each of which supervise patrol shift. And then we have 18 officers. 14 are assigned to patrol. 2 are assigned to the SRO division, and 2 are assigned as detectives. We get into staffing. We can't, in police work, you can't talk about staffing without talking about turnover. And that's not unique to Smithville. It's not unique to the Kansas City metro area or Missouri at all. Talking with chiefs all over, whether we're at conferences or on conference calls now, really, or phone calls, this is an issue everybody sees and everybody deals with. So we went back and we looked at the last 20 years worth of data, and we averaged that out, and we looked at just full-time officers. We didn't calculate in reserve officers. And that red line there in the middle, it's fairly flat. It's decreasing ever so slightly is actually our trend line there, which stays pretty consistent over the last 20 years. And, you know, we check with some neighboring agencies. We found not many departments are tracking this information. They're not looking at it regularly, routinely, and they're certainly not able to tell you on average how many officers they have turnover in a year. But I did get some kind of off the cuff information from several departments in both Clay and Platte. And they seem to all average somewhere between 2 and 4 officers per year, with 1 slightly larger agency than ours that's a little unlucky that seems to average about 5 to 6 a year. So we looked at this in 2 different decades. We looked at 2000 to 2009. And during that time, we averaged about 2.6 officers a year, which comes out to about 21.5% of what staffing levels were during 2000. And then we looked at the second decade, 2010 to 2019, and we found we were down. We'd actually went down. That was actually a surprise when we crunched numbers. and we were down to 2.3 per year, which actually comes out to about 11.5% of our 2019 staffing levels. So while our average turnover went down slightly, we've increased staff, and that's brought that percentage down by about 10%. We also looked at tenure of officers over those two tenure periods, and we've been able to increase tenure by about 50% from 4.2 to 6.3 years of service from first decade to the second. So we've been able to reduce the percentage of turnover and raise the time they're staying here. So we're pleased with that. One other thing we looked at was kind of staffing levels compared to allocation levels. And we looked as far back as we could in the data we have, which goes back to January 1/14. We were able to go through the end of July, 79 months. And out of that time, we had 18 months, and those 18 months aren't consecutive, but we had 18 months where we were fully staffed there. Checking with some other agencies, that's not an uncommon thing for other agencies to see as well. Most agencies run under what their maximum allocation is, just by attrition, whether it's people leaving voluntarily or involuntarily, retirements and stuff like that. We outlined our hiring process, and this process you see on the screen has been relatively stable for about the last 10 plus years. It's evolved over time and has expanded. But this has served us well for the better part of a decade, maybe even a little more than that, with this kind of 17-step process you see here. One thing we have found in law enforcement circles is we do kind of have a reputation for having a thorough hiring process, and particularly the background process. As people run through that process and come on board, we regularly hear that it's one of the more intensive processes that they've been through, especially when we bring people on from different agencies that have been through it multiple times. And this current process takes anywhere from 3.5 to 4.5 months roughly to run through on average. We're able to kind of speed up and compress that on the front end. There's several of those steps that we make a conscious effort to not drag our feet on. And then when you start getting around step 7 and 8 there, when we get into the personal history and the background, that's really when things kind of slow down, and we really dig into people's background and want to know who we're getting and who we're bringing on. And that's where we run into kind of slowing the process down there. And previously, before we kind of made an effort to speed things up on the front end, we found we were running kind of 6 to 8 months on a process. So we've been able to cut that down to speed the process up and bring people on quicker. Next in your information, we kind of hit on calls for service. This graph kind of graphs out the last 7.5 years of calls for service. Now that 3,900 there for 2000 or for 2020, that's a projected number. That's where we think we'll be right around the end of the year based on the first 7 months. At the end of July, we were setting at about almost 2,200 calls. So if we project that out, we're going to be close to 39 to 4,000, kind of putting us back on track around 16, 17 numbers. And with the slowdown with COVID and everything in the spring, that's not a surprise. Was really kind of what we expected to find there. This is the same data, but just looking at kind of calls for service and population, and no real surprises here. As more people move into town, things get busier. And we're in a census year. We're going to see that 2020 number. And I have no doubt it's going to go up as well. So I think these numbers both are going to trend up for the next decade. Then after calls, we kind of got into what's called UCR reportable offenses. And these are standardized offenses from the FBI. And these are stats that we submit monthly to the federal government to kind of track crime stats. And this is what a lot of places look at when they do their safest cities lists and stuff like that. That's where they get that information is from the FBI's website. Now that 134 for 2020. That is an actual number through the end of July. That's not a projection. That project number comes out to be around 230. So we're going to be right on track to be close to or just under last year's numbers, total UCR offenses. If you look at the table on the right, you can see that we're down in most offenses. We project that sex assaults and rapes are going to, at the end of the year, are going to be below last year's. Assaults and simple assaults are going to trend to be real close to the 19 numbers. Burglaries and larcenies are trending to be below 19's numbers at the end of the year. And auto thefts are going to trend to be above 19 at the end of this year. And discussing this with administrative staff and with our detectives and even some of our senior officers, with what we saw with COVID in the spring, we don't have a lot of surprises here. Our sexual assault numbers, our sexual assault reports are way down. That's common in a lot of departments. And a lot of that is because we're not getting reported crimes involving children. A lot of those come through the school and through counselors, whether children disclose to counselors or teachers or peers, who then in turn disclose to counselors or teachers. With schools being closed, we haven't had that avenue to get those reported offenses to us. My administrative staff and the captain, the sergeants, Jeanette will tell you, and probably most of the patrol officers will tell you, they've heard it from me over and over again, and that is that modern policing is data driven. And policing has made a move in modern history towards a data driven approach, and we're doing the same thing. And this is kind of a working definition of what that is, but we're making a conscious effort to move towards that data-driven approach to policing, using data to make better decisions, to make more decisions, and kind of going, some of the simple concepts I remember learning in high school when I took a basic computer course on an Apple IIe, the simple garbage in, garbage out, reminding our folks of that. What we found when we went to consciously make this move, patrol officers used to fill out what's called a daily log. And that's was a paper form that the officers wrote down everything they did, whether they handled a call, whether they checked a business, whether they drove through a neighborhood, whether they made contacts. It was all captured on that log. And then it was filed in a file cabinet, rarely to be seen again. Occasionally we would pull them out when there was need, but there was a lot of data that sat on those pages that just wasn't able to be utilized. So we've made a effort to better use that data, because we do gather a lot of data on there. We have gone away from a paper log. We've adapted some infrastructure in our current records management system to allow officers to input that data electronically and at their fingertips. And then that allows us to better pull that data out and look at it and use it. And some of that, this table's got a little bit of that data that we're able to get that we weren't able to look at just a year ago. That process, transitioning from paper logs to what we call the electronic system, started back in early 19. And then kind of went live department wide in the fall of 19. So we're really starting to get full department participation into the year 19, into early 2020. And we're able to look at stuff as like, number of business checks for the first 7 months of the year, or number of subdivision checks for that same time of the year. And we're able to look at things that you just couldn't see when it was on paper, like the citizens assist, the funeral escorts, the vehicle lockouts. Those are the kind of things that a small community like ours is able to offer its citizens, that we're able to be more community oriented and able to offer those things that kind of contribute to that small town feel that we have that makes Smithville kind of unique. And honestly, it's probably a reason that several of us moved here. So we're going to be able to look at those. We're going to be able to track those. We're going to be able to see where they trend and use that in decision-making and in guiding the department as we go forward. And those are things, larger departments just don't offer their citizens. Unlocking a vehicle when you lock your keys in it at the gas station. The open door number you see there, that 263, the vast majority of those, all but a handful, those are open doors that officers have found, typically on the night shift, usually driving around neighborhoods. Those include garage doors and vehicle doors typically. And most of those folks, unfortunately, were waking up in the night to get them to secure their belongings, and hopefully they're not missing anything. And that averages, crunching those numbers, that's a little over 1 per shift when we look at that. So that's something we'll be continuing to watch there as well. Next, we give you some information on some policies. And we looked at three key policies, really. We've used a company called Lexapol for a little over 10 years. Lexapol makes recommendations. They help write policies. They have a platform with a dashboard to manage all this. Lexapol looks at federal case law, state case law, best practices, local law and federal guidelines and everything to make sure all our policies meet and fall within those guidelines and they're legally defensible. They also offer a service that we've utilized for the past 10 plus years for daily training of officers. And an officer comes in, starts his or her shift. One of the first things they do is they log into the Lexapol system, and there's what's called a daily training bulletin. And that daily training bulletin has a short scene or scenario that the officer reads through, references back to policy, and then asks a couple simple questions. Is it in a policy or out of policy, or what is allowed and what's not allowed, or what should the officer do or shouldn't do? And then it cites the policy, and then the officers are tested over that, and all that is documented and tracked as well. So that's a big benefit we get out of Lexapol. It sounds small, but when you look at it over the whole year, officers are constantly being trained and referred back to policy. So they don't just look at the use of force policy once a year and sign off on it and say, yes, I've read it, I understand it. Regularly, and particularly high liability, low frequency policies like use of force and vehicle pursuits. Those are touched on multiple times in every month. So they do kind of keep their feet wet in that as well. You have with you in your packet a copy of Lexapol's recommendations for changes. And typically Lexapol makes changes to policies 4 times a year. With current events, we received notice earlier they were going to do some updates before that time. And we actually just received this policy about 10 days ago. So you have the red line version. All the recommendations you see in front of you from Lexapol and the additions, staff's going to recommend implementing, and we will be implementing shortly. But this is kind of a list of the high points on what changes in there. There's updates to definitions. We've expanded duty to intercede to also include not only intercede, but to report that. There's a requirement on de-escalation. It touches on the carotid control hold and explains that hold is only going to be allowed during deadly force situations, encounters where deadly force would be authorized. Warnings before the use of deadly force, medical considerations, supervisors' responsibilities, and then training of officers there. So those are the high points on the changes that are coming to the use of force policy. After we looked at use of force policy, we wanted to look at use of force data. And I asked Captain Roteman to pull all the data for the last 4 full years and then the partial year of 2020. So that 2020 number, that is through the end of July. That's on trend to be somewhere between 2018 and 2019's number by the end of the year. So you can kind of see we had some elevation there, dropped off in 19, and then 2020 is going to kind of rebound back and be somewhere between, we're probably guessing 17, 18 instances by the end of the year. So once we looked at that, we broke these down into some basic categories. And you see those categories on the right there, everything, and they're listed in ascending order. Everything from muscling techniques, which is something as simple as when you go to handcuff somebody and they pull away, making them put their hands behind their back and placing handcuffs on them, all the way through actual defensive tactics and holds, through uses of taser, less lethal deployments, and then firearms. So we combed through all that 4.5 years worth of data, divided them up into these basic classifications to see kind of where the force was being used. And at first blush, you kind of had some surprises. It's no surprise that muscling techniques comes out on as a high number. In fact, a lot of departments don't even consider that a use of force, a reportable use of force, and don't track that. We do, because that's primarily what you see a lot of. Defensive tactics and holds, those are fairly low when you look at that over 4.5 years. Taser display, we don't do very often. You can see usually if a taser has to come out of a holster, usually somebody just seeing it will get their attention and gain compliance. And then we've only really had 2 taser deployments in that time frame. And then that number there, firearms display, I'm sure that jumped out at everybody when you look at that being the highest number there. It did for me. So what we did is we looked at that and we dissected that and found that really came down to 3 main areas in the display of firearms. And that come down to armed parties, pursuits, and felony in progress calls. And pursuits, you can see, takes up about half of that, which is not a surprise. Officers are taught from the academy and all through continued training, when a pursuit ends, they transition to what's called a felony car stop. And that is a slow, controlled process, usually with firearms out, where just specific commands are given. Individuals are taken out one at a time and taken into custody one at a time under controlled circumstances. The last thing we want after a pursuit, which is a highly emotional situation, is for officers to be running up to cars and trying to remove people from cars. And you get officers hurt, you get individuals hurt. So that's why that process is taught that way and trained that way, and has been for a long time. The armed parties and the felony in progress, most of the felony in progress calls involve felony stops very similar to the pursuit, because it's involving a reported felony, a reported armed party, and then the 9 that were actually armed. Some of those armed parties equated to crimes, and some of them, the majority of those, were what we would call crisis, people in crisis, more likely people likely to do self-harm and posed a bigger threat to themselves. So you've got a copy of the use of force review board policy, and that's been in place for quite some time. It's not convened on every use of force. It's convened when there is serious injury or discharge of a firearm. And there's been some minor changes to that, and really clarifying when that board's convened, and adding the exception of when animals are put down. That wasn't in there before, and we just wanted to clarify that and make that black and white. so it follows policy and practice. And that kind of runs us up to the end of that 13 pages that you were given. And I know that's just the high points and a rather quick run through, kind of like David did earlier today. So I'm really gonna just open up and see what questions you all have and what we can help to explain and what information we can get y'all.
Hey, Chief?
Yeah.
Is there anything that we need to be looking at for the future that you haven't already covered? Do you see any concerns?
Captain Roteman and I have been talking about that for, well, last part of this week and next, because, we're coming up on budget time and everything. I don't see anything major. I think a lot of what we would ask is kind of with our current department, kind of the path we've been down is kind of staying the course. We're setting this rhythm of replacing equipment as needed, kind of like we talked about radios last meeting. We've been replacing tasers a handful of time every year for a few years, so that we don't have to come up and replace everything at once. And right now, that's really something, just to replace the steady replacement of equipment as it wears out and before it becomes completely unusable. I know later in the next meeting, we're going to have the enterprise contract that kind of deals with fleet vehicles and white vehicles. And then next year, we will probably start the conversation about replacement of some patrol vehicles, because they'll start getting up there in miles and at the stage where we'll want to start replacing those and making determination which ones need replaced when, and hopefully before any major repairs there. As the city grows and as call volumes grow, you'll see requests for personnel, but in the short term, and when I say short term, 2, 3, maybe 4 years, I don't foresee that really coming in the next 2, 3 years. And when that does come forward, that will tie back to a lot of that when we touched on data-driven policing. It's going to be driven a lot by call volume and number of calls and average time on scene. Is to just, how many, we have X number of calls, we spend X number of time on those calls. How many man hours is that? And how many full-time employees does that equate to?
Thank you, Chief.
So we're really pretty fortunate when it comes to equipment and stuff like that. When you got the first blush at the budget last meeting, if you'll remember, there was a line in there for a new records management system for the police department. Our current system is 20 years old and has had one major update, and that was to update it to what they call a SQL database, which I think is, at least at that time, was the latest and greatest. But it's a dated system, and it's got its limitations. And tying in with the data-driven approach and trying to gather as much data to make good decisions as possible. Moving forward, any system we look at is we're gonna weigh that heavy and want to know a lot from the vendors about how they gather data, how they're able to extract data and use data and stuff like that. So really, that's probably the biggest one on our short-term radar, is that records management system.
Yeah, unfortunately, data needs to be shared instantly anymore.
It is, and that's one other thing we've talked about and talking with some neighboring agencies who have gone through the transition on records management systems, and they're looking at interoperability and data sharing as well. I remember when we bought this current system in 2000 and went through the transition from an old DOS-based system to this current system. It was the first Windows-based system we ever had. And it was like night and day going from DOS to Windows. But it's a painstaking process, and I swore I never wanted to do it again in my life. Yet here we are 20 years later, and I'm asking you to go through it again in the next 12, 14 months. But it's come to that time, and we're going to have to go through it sooner or later. But interoperability and data sharing, we will be looking at as well, to increase efficiency and just, our bad guys here in town don't just stay in Smithville, and they're not local Smithville people. They come from all across the metro. You know, we've got documented cases with criminals coming from everywhere from Olathe and over into southern Kansas metro, all the way out into Lee Summit, Blue Springs, that area as well. The two from the most recent incident up at Taco Bell when it was broken into overnight, one of them was from Olathe and one of them was from Blue Springs, and they were here together. So they put some miles on to get to us. So
Thank you.
no, thank you, sir.
I got a question.
Yeah.
How do we plan for new police vehicles? Is there a process like we have with Enterprise for our white vehicles? Is there some sort of process like that for police vehicles?
In talking with Enterprise, there doesn't seem to be many people tackling that like Enterprise does regular fleet vehicles. And talking with them, part of it has to do with, we put a lot of equipment in vehicles, and that causes modifications and holes are drilled and things are attached to vehicles. And I think that typically in the civilian market, people aren't fond of. Now, if you're buying a used car for a 16-year-old and it's got a couple holes in the dash where lights were mounted, mom and dad probably aren't worried about that, because I remember buying one or two cars for a 16-year-old boy, and if I could pick something up for $1,200, I would have. But if I was buying it for my wife, that'd have been a no-go. She did not go in for that.
And
Cynthia,
Chief,
you want to chime in?
if I might jump in just a little
Please
bit,
do.
Steve, one of the things as we go through the budget process next year, as the chief had indicated, is we will spend some time studying the police department fleet. Typically in review of a police fleet, you know, you'll look around and kind of like the chief talked about earlier, it's hard to make comparisons because different agencies operate in different ways. But there are a lot of benchmarks of age, mileage, and kind of use on the vehicles, and really looking at the cost of maintenance. Because we are a smaller department, our vehicles, and we're a long community, our vehicles are run quite a bit. We have a little bit higher mileage on our vehicles than some I've seen in some other communities where there might be, you know, a 1-to-1 ratio on fleet. We have a lot of shared vehicles, but there you take into consideration a number of those factors, including maintenance and condition as well. So those are, if you'll remember when Nikki presented information a year ago this spring, when we started looking at vehicle replacement in general, those are things that we started looking at. We knew we needed to get a better indication of that information and a better understanding of our fleet. Enterprise will help us with that, with the white fleet, like you had indicated, we'll have a good indication. The difference there is that's going to be driven really a lot by resale value. On the police side, we'll really look at those traditional ways of age, mileage, and kind of condition. Does that make sense?
Yes. Do we do any kind of budgeting though for future vehicles? For future fleet vehicles?
We have not purchased police. Jason, you got a new vehicle. I think you got either one or two in 2018.
18, yeah.
And we
that was
didn't
last year.
We kind of have put them on hold in development of the 19 budget, in wanting to look at our fleet assessment, and we continue that hold in development of the 2020 budget because the condition of the fleet was pretty good. And really, we wanted to look at it in view of the vehicle leasing, and now we'll really delve into that. So next year we may see some needs in the department. I think one of the things for us to look at as well is, you know, we have the vehicle replacement and reserve fund that we're going to be implementing. I think we need to make sure that we start putting some money aside that will address police vehicles as well.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody have anything else?
Alderman Blunker, you can go ahead.
Thank you for the thorough information, Chief. As I think we've talked before, you know, one of the hardest things to do is to review the the police budget and make sure that we provide for the needs of our citizens from a public safety perspective. I know we've got 2 former officers on the board, but you know, the police department spending represents, you know, greater than 40% of our budget. So I think the first question I asked Ms. Wagner when we were interviewing was, how are you going to help us say no to the police department when it's appropriate? I think that's the hard part. And so certainly in this day and age of the conversations that are going on across the country, I want to be clear that I don't think we're talking about that, but how do we provide the right resources at the right time and ensure that we provide what you need? I appreciate the discussion on use of force and the carotid hold. I know that you know, when you're fighting for your life, that's an important tactic to have. You know, this is covered recently by the Kansas City Star, and they highlighted the fact that Smithville and I think Kansas City were the only departments in the area that were still teaching that method. Do you believe that that's accurate? And if so, I think we haven't used it in a number of years. And what are your thoughts on how we proceed with that?
We've had that conversation around the department, both with the administrative staff, with our on-staff instructor. I do think while that article mentioned Kansas City and us, you know, they mentioned who responded to their calls. I know of departments that just didn't return the Star's calls, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't feel like that was right. And you know, when they call and ask for information that I can give them readily, I do that. So we looked at that, and we've consulted with Lexapol. And if you'll notice, and I'm sure this jumps out at everybody, and nobody said it yet, so I'm gonna go ahead and throw it out there. That policy doesn't mention chokeholds. And we've wrestled with this. And it wasn't until we found that white paper that we included in there from Lexapol that kind of shed some light on it. It's not mentioned. Chokeholds aren't mentioned. We'll come back to the vascular neck restraint. Chokeholds aren't mentioned because they've never been taught by this department. They've never been condoned by this department. They've never been trained by this department. So they're not an authorized technique. However, in a deadly force encounter, it would be acceptable to use one in a life and death situation. Ms. Wagner and I were talking late last week, and I likened it to, you know, just recently, we had a local business who donated a truck to a veteran who stopped an active shooter on the Leavenworth Bridge. And the weapon of his choice was his vehicle. And he saved lives that day. There are situations where an officer may do something like that. But we don't teach on it. We don't train on it. There's no class for something like that. Kansas City's been instrumental in the vascular neck restraint. They have developed it and taught it and had the research to support it, much like what you saw from Lexapol in their white paper for decades. I will maintain that medically the likelihood of injury is relatively low. So if an officer gets into a situation where he or she needs to apply that because it's an elevated situation where it is a deadly force encounter, I would rather them know how to properly apply it to reduce the likelihood of injury than to just tell them, do whatever you need to do to save your life. And that's kind of the reasoning behind still leaving it in there. I know a lot of departments, I won't say a lot. I know of some that while they still leave it in there, it's getting pushed up the list, like what we're doing here, to a deadly force encounter. I know of a couple that, at least right now, they're going to leave it where it is on their continuum. And I'll be honest with you, Kansas City's kind of the big dog on the block. Don't know what Kansas City's going to do. But I work here, and I'm concerned with what goes on here in Smithville. So that's kind of the thought behind that. If we want to discuss that further, I'm more than willing to. I'm happy to, and may even want to seek some counsel from legal if need be.
No, I think you addressed what I wanted you to. That It is truly life and death situation. It's truly used in an appropriate manner, trained appropriately, and that it is that, outside of a discharging a firearm, that last resort that's available for our officers and trained on appropriately, medical personnel called appropriately, all the things trained the way it needs to be, and therefore an appropriate tactic that's available. So thank you for covering that.
Absolutely. And that is, heaven forbid one of our folks ever get in that situation. While I want them to be able to use it to preserve their life, I also want them to hopefully not cause lasting injury to somebody else. And hopefully everybody goes home at the end of the day. And if we can teach them to properly apply a technique, even though it may be classified as a deadly force use, if we can teach them how to properly apply it, to not cause lasting injury and only to gain compliance and control of somebody, then to me, that's worth spending the time and effort to do in-service training a few times a year and keep them fresh on those kind of techniques. So that's kind of where we were coming from on that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Anything
Anyone
else I
else?
can try to address for y'all?
John, is that your raising your hand or you're flipping a pen?
It's a mouse, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Well, I want to thank y'all for giving us a chance to present some of this information. I know it turned out to be a lot. Like I said before, that wasn't my goal when I started writing this. I was hoping for a few pages, and I think Cynthia will vouch for me. When we started, I said I'll have 3 or 4 slides to go through, and we'll get through this pretty quick. And a few weeks later, I tell her I'm writing a term paper. And as we go through the comp plan, I've watched it go through this last couple of years with the city and seeing kind of the mission, vision, values, process, and all that. Cynthia and I have started talking about how we may apply that concept to the department as well, both for mission statement and a vision statement and values, and not just something that the chief comes out of his office like Moses with tablets and hands it down to everybody and decrees it, but to involve our frontline people in that process, like we were able to involve, city staff and have a hand in it. And I think that develops ownership and it makes it theirs. So it shouldn't just be me telling the staff, this is our mission and we'll do A, B, and C. I want their input on that. And it also gives us a chance to tie that back to the city's vision and values as well, so that they kind of work hand in hand with each other. And, we're all on the same team. I may wear a uniform and a patch and drive a car that sticks out, but I'm still a city employee, just like everybody else. We all play for the same team. So that's kind of looking forward in the next couple of years, what you might see. You may see something in a budget for some money to do kind of the visioning process in the department on a smaller scale, and tying back together to what the city's already started to lay foundation for already. So, and that's all I got. I've taken up enough time and droned on. So thank you very much, unless anybody's got any other questions.
Thank you, Chief. I don't have anything else. Does anybody have anything? Chuck, don't watch the replay. You'll cry.
We actually got it done. Man, he made a presentation in less than 35 minutes. No, he made a presentation in 20 minutes and answered questions. So maybe
Yeah.
Public Works could take a lesson.
No, they're so fun. Anyway, I guess I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Or do you want to just so everybody can get a little break and then we'll start again at 7?
Linda, we stay on that. We adjourn this, right? And we'll start the new meeting, but we stay on this Zoom call, or do we close this one? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we'll stay on this one.
I need a new pen.
I'm bringing it.
Somebody left an Independence, Missouri pen on my desk.
That's got to go.
That garbage.
Easy now.
All right. Any motion to adjourn? Anybody?
So moved.
Second. Anybody? Chevalier?
I will second that.
Thank you. All in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. We stand adjourned. Is that you echoing?